Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I begin in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. Dear viewers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. A very good evening on this very cold Friday evening. It's Ahmad Bostan with you here on Behind the Headlines, where we have the great pleasure and honor of interviewing some of the most inspirational personalities around the country and around the world. The aim and the objective of the program is simple: to inspire and motivate all of us to do more, to do better in our chosen path in life. Remember, this program is live on British Muslim TV, so please feel free to get in touch with us at any time with your questions, your comments. 01924 231 083 is a studio number that gets you to me. That's 01924 231 083. You can also get in touch with us on Twitter. We're at British Muslim TV, and we're also British Muslim TV on Facebook. Now, today it gives me the great honor and privilege to be interviewing someone who is one of the most influential politicians in the country today. He is someone who has spent many decades serving the poorest and most vulnerable in society in the capacity of a Legal Aid Solicitor, but the job he does today is a very, very significant one indeed. At the heart of the second largest police force in our country is Simon Foster, who is the West Midlands Police and Crime Commissioner, and it's my great honour and privilege to be interviewing him on the programme this evening. A very good evening, Simon. Thank you very much for joining us on Behind the Headlines tonight.
Good evening, Ahmad Bostan. I must say that I'm already motivated to do better as a consequence of that introduction from you. So thank you very much. Just like to say good evening to all your viewers. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks very much for the invitation.
Thank you so much, and the pleasure is all ours, I can assure you. Now, Simon, I want to start from the very beginning. Born in the wonderful northern city, Yorkshire city of Sheffield, what was your childhood like? What was it like growing up in and around Sheffield?
Well, I only lived, although I was born in Sheffield, I only lived there for a very short period of time, I have to say. We then moved around when I was very young. We lived in Bradford, we lived in York, we lived in Colwyn Bay in North Wales. But we settled, by the time I was about 2 years old, we settled just in between Derby and Nottingham. So that's where my family home was. That's where I was brought up in the East Midlands, in a town just in between Derby and Nottingham. Mm. But yeah, well, growing up was good, Bostan. Had a very happy childhood. Played lots of sport. Absolutely loved sport. Mm. Spent probably far too much of my time playing football and cricket. Mm-hmm. And certainly in my early years, that was certainly something that I had a real passion about. I mean, I still do, but obviously I don't play anymore. Mm.
Where did that passion for sport come from? Was it something quite common for children of your age to get involved in football, cricket? Was that the pastime of that time, I suppose, rather than the games consoles and all those gadgets and gizmos we have today?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly for me, it was definitely football and cricket. I mean, particularly football. It was something that you would play when you got to school in the morning. You'd play at break, you'd play at lunchtime, you'd play at break in the afternoon, and then you'd go home and play football again. And obviously, as you got a little bit older, you played for the school, you played for boys clubs, and you played for your county. So, you know, that's what I spent a lot of my time doing as a young person growing up, and equally with cricket as well. And yeah, I mean, that was definitely something that probably everybody was interested in at that time, for sure. And yes, certainly there were no computer games or games consoles around when I was growing up. I mean, bear in mind that I'll be 61 this birthday, so you can see that there weren't really computer games around when I was young.
Wow. Well, you certainly don't come across as 61, Simon. There you go, to your credit. Your energy and enthusiasm is certainly one that many, probably 20, 30 years younger than you, would aspire to have. So growing up at that time, Simon, obviously back in the 50s, 60s, a lot of poverty, a lot of deprivation, especially in the Midlands, the northern towns and cities as well. Were you alive to that at that time? Were you aware of those circumstances around you? Did you have much sort of thinking space around that? Even, I suppose, in those early days, were you thinking about politics?
I mean, I was certainly a child of the 60s, Boston, not the 50s, to be fair. You're making me even older there. But yeah, certainly I was born in 61. So yeah, I grew up as a child of the 60s and the 70s, I guess. Was I aware of that when I was growing up? I wasn't when I was really young, no. I suppose I was aware of it in the sense that both my parents came from working class backgrounds. My mother came from Liverpool. Her father, for example, was an unemployed, unskilled labourer for much of his life. And she came from a very poor background. And my father's came from a working class background from Darlaston in the Black Country. His father was a nut and bolt maker in a factory in Darlaston. So I was very aware of it in that sense. But no, I mean, I grew up in a relatively well provided for household, mainly Bostan, because as a consequence of the emerging welfare state in this country and the 1945 Labour government, my parents had the opportunity to, as a consequence of education, they had an opportunity, probably the first generation of the country from working class backgrounds, to be able to go to university, frankly. And the two of them were fortunate enough to go from working class backgrounds into university, and as a consequence of education, they were able to acquire, a lifestyle and a professional background that their parents could only have dreamt of at the time. So that was certainly transformational for them. It was transformational for our family, and I will never forget that was as a consequence of the emerging welfare state that was provided for by the 1945 Labour government. That gave them opportunities that their parents could only ever have dreamt of.
And at that time, that post-war era, and people very much really drawing upon that huge sacrifice made by so many men and women of working class backgrounds during the war, putting themselves on the line, really changed the society around us for good. And as you said there, Simon, a very important reflection there, just how important it was that safety net was created and literally changed the face of not only your mother's and father's future, your future, and all the generations that will come after you and I, which is incredible when you think about it. Do you think when you look back at that time, was there enough of a realization among people around the significance of the welfare state, around, for example, now, the NHS? No politician of any party will ever speak against the NHS. Was there that appreciation that, wow, we went through an absolutely transformational period as a country?
Well, I think there was an appreciation of the status and the significance that was provided for by the National Health Service, that was provided for by access to social housing, that was provided for by access to work and employment, and was provided for by access to state education that enabled you to have the opportunity of going on into higher education and obtaining a professional qualification, for example. I mean, I certainly, I mean, in terms of my kind of early recollections around that, as I say, it was certainly as a consequence of my parents' upbringing that I was aware of it, and it was as a consequence of the the background that my grandparents had, because I would go and visit them. So I became aware from a very early age that the background that they had growing up. And I guess the first general election that I can remember was in 1970, and you might remember that was the election in which the Conservative government actually was successful, of course, under Edward Heath. But I remember in school at the time, the teacher holding a kind of classroom election amongst the children in the class, and I remember the teacher saying, "Oh, go back and discuss this with your with your parents." And I remember distinctly. I mean, I would have been 9 years old, but I have a very vivid memory of discussing this with my mum at the time. And my mum said to me, because I asked her, who would she be voting for in the general election, and she said she would be voting Labour. And she would be voting Labour because Labour was always had the best interests of ordinary working people at its heart, and that's what it was there to do, was to promote the interests of ordinary people and to fight against poverty. And I remember her saying that. I was about 9 years old, and I remember going back to the classroom the following day and voting Labour in the classroom election, and I never looked back since.
Wow. So politics, and particularly your connection to the Labour Party, came at a very early age for you. We are going to continue talking about the journey of West Midlands Police and Crime Commissioner Simon Foster. He's in charge of the second largest police force in the entire country today. But as he's just said, his grandfather was making nuts and bolts back all those decades ago, and how incredible it was that the welfare state, that support system, was created that allowed his parents and Simon, all of his siblings and future generations to be able to grow up and be a part of all those opportunities, regardless of their economic background. We'll be back right after this. Stay tuned to Behind the Headlines. Dear viewers, Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Behind the Headlines here on British Muslim TV with me, Ahmad Bostan. Tonight we have the great honour and privilege to be in conversation with West Midlands Police and Crime Commissioner Simon Foster, talking about his life, his journey, what has led him to the influential office that he holds today. And Simon, just before the break, we were speaking about how circumstances for your parents and family changed as a result of the post-war government, the welfare state, the NHS, and so much support that had become available on the part of the state that was never the case historically here in Britain, even as recent as those times. You went on to secondary school, transitioned into higher education, and you said before that your parents were able to provide for you reasonably comfortably because of those opportunities. But that transition you made to higher education, was that something that your peers who were perhaps from less well-off backgrounds, were they able to also make that transition as easily as you were at the time, from what you recall?
I went to a state comprehensive. I went to the local comprehensive, fairly close to where we lived. And I had, generally speaking, I had a really great time at school. That state comprehensive was a great experience for me. And I mean, in terms of, I have to say that in my teenage years, from about 11 to 16, I have to say that I wasn't terribly motivated when it came to working academically. As I say, I was probably far more interested in playing football and cricket and sport generally. That was where my main interest lay in those days. So probably didn't apply myself as conscientiously as I might have done between the ages of about 11 to 16. But I think that probably changed. Well, that changed very drastically when I got to about the age of 16 or so, and ended up going into the sixth form to study for what were then, of course, A levels. And I then did become very motivated academically, and I worked very hard after that in order, because I suppose by that age I had decided that I wanted to go to university to study law, and that was something that I'd kind of settled on very firmly. That was something I became incredibly committed to wanting to do, and I realized that if I was going to be able to get to university and study law, then I was going to have to work quite hard to do that. And sure enough, I did work. I did work very hard at school between about the age of 16 to 18, and I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity of going off to Sheffield University to study law. I mean, in terms of my peer group, I have to say that many of them didn't fulfill their potential. I have to say, many of them didn't go on to higher education. I mean, some did, but many of them didn't. Right. And that was something that that I always I do reflect on sometimes, because they were certainly as able and capable as me, but for various reasons that they didn't always, for one reason or another, go on and fulfill their potential. I mean, some of them went back to higher education when they were older. Sure. So that, but I mean, I had a really good group of friends at school. Really enjoyed it. Got a lot out of it. As I say, played a lot of cricket, played a lot of football, and actually did quite a lot of acting and drama as well when I was at school. Wow. So it was a good positive experience at school. I mean, one of the things I always remember about being at school, I suppose, is just the amount of time we spent kind of laughing, actually, in a way that perhaps you don't always have the opportunity to do as you grow into adult life. I just remember it as kind of overwhelmingly kind of a positive and fun experience all round, I would say. But so in 1979, I went off to university to Sheffield to study law.
Wow. Now, just reflecting on that a moment, that transition, you said from sort of 11 to 16, you were dreaming of becoming that internationally renowned football player, the holder of the World Cup, either in football, and if failing football, then cricket. How did that transition take place? Because it seems like two very different worlds, the world of sport, fun and laughter, to law. Didn't you think back then law's a bit boring? How did that come about, that change?
That's a very good question. I mean, I still carried on playing sport. I still played a lot of football and cricket, but I guess my priorities changed quite significantly at that age. I suppose, as I say, I just realised that I wanted to go and study law, and I guess at that age I kind of had decided that I wanted to be a lawyer as well. I wanted to kind of practice law. So when I kind of formed that ambition, I was pretty single-minded about that after that. I realised that I really did have to buckle down and dedicate myself to working really hard in order to achieve that objective.
Was that about...
that's what I did.
In your mind at the time, and casting your mind back now, was that around security in terms of financial security? Because quite often, especially in many of the viewers who are watching right now will be able to relate to this, particularly in many Muslim households across the country. Growing up, a lot of parents want their children to become either doctors, barristers, solicitors, because they've experienced poverty and they don't want their children to ever be wanting for anything. Was there an element of that, do you think, in your mind, influenced by your parents, that, you know what, law's good, it's going to pay the bills and give you a comfortable life, I suppose?
I guess there was an element of that. I mean, I certainly do remember my father telling me that, well, I mean, if you're able to secure a professional qualification, you will have, you will have some independence. You will have some security as a consequence of that. So, that was some attraction to me. But I have to say that it really wasn't the main motivation. My main motivation behind wanting to become a lawyer was a real passion for wanting to be able to use the law as a method of ensuring access to justice, equality before the law and the rule of law for all, and not just for the few. Because by that stage in my life, I had become quite politically conscious about the need for social justice, and I saw an opportunity by becoming a lawyer to have an opportunity to, I guess, become a lawyer who was going to advise people and represent them who might not otherwise have an opportunity to secure access to justice, equality before the law, and the rule of law. So by about that age, I was pretty determined that about the type of lawyer that I wanted to be. I wanted to be a lawyer who was going to represent people from social and economically deprived backgrounds, who was going to represent people from diverse communities, who was going to represent people who perhaps suffered disability for one reason or another as a consequence of mental ill health or drug or alcohol addiction, for example. So I was pretty convinced that that was what I was wanting to do by about that age. And that is indeed something that I did pursue into my professional career as well.
Is there a particular story, Simon, that stays with you in your mind, a grave injustice that you witnessed or multiples of injustices that you saw going on that actually created that mindset for you that, you know what, I need to go out there and be part of delivering justice for these people? Is there a particular story that sticks out in your mind that really started that moment for you?
I don't think I'd be able to relate one particular story about it. I think it was just something that it was just a sense of justice that I had, and a feeling that everybody was entitled to justice, irrespective of the background circumstances from which they came. And although obviously it may well be possible for people from relatively well-off backgrounds to be able to access the law and secure their legal entitlements. But if, as I say, you come from social and economically deprived backgrounds, or you perhaps come from a background which might traditionally mean that you would not necessarily be able to access your legal rights, then that was something that really did motivate me. It really did drive me. I wanted to become a lawyer who was going to represent those people and give them the opportunity to access justice and ensure equality before the law and the rule of law for all. That was what really became a kind of primary driving factor for me, I would say.
Finally, Simon, we are coming up to a break, but just before we do so, university, what was that like for you? Was it a challenging time? Many young people nowadays often have to really agonize over that decision to go to university because of how much is it going to cost and how much will it cost me to live away from home? What was it like for you?
Well, of course, in those days, university was a very different experience in that sense, Bostan, because of course there were not student loans. You obtained a grant, and I went to university. I went to university as an undergraduate, studied law for 3 years. I went to Chester Law College to study for my solicitor's finals. So I had 4 years higher education, and I came out of that 4 years of higher education knowing nothing as a consequence of that system that existed then. And of course, I am all too well aware that that system is all too different for young people today, and I often do reflect on the fact that that it's not fair that so many of those people who benefited from that system were then responsible for implementing a system that meant so many young people come out of university owing many thousands of pounds.
We are going to continue speaking with Simon Foster, the West Midlands Police and Crime Commissioner, about his life after this break. And remember, if you've got any question for Simon, if you want to get in touch, please do so. Our studio number is 01924 231 083. We're at British Muslim TV on Twitter. We're also British Muslim TV on Facebook. Simon there speaking about his university life and reflecting upon the fact that during his day, there were no costs of going to university that you would have to incur in terms of debts and loans. In fact, it was an investment by the state into you, a young person. We'll be back right after this break. Dear viewers, Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Behind the Headlines here on British Muslim TV. We have the immense honour and privilege tonight to be in conversation with one of the most influential politicians in the country, a beacon in regional government today. Mr. Simon Foster is the Police and Crime Commissioner for the region of the West Midlands, the second largest police force in the country. But today we're talking to him about his life and journey, and we left him before the break at university studying law, free of charge, all courtesy of the taxpayer back then, and very much seen as an investment in young people, something that's changed under successive governments, both Labour and Conservative since. But again, it's a reflection that needs to be had on how things were back then and whether we've gone backwards or forwards so far as that particular element of university education is concerned. So Simon, we left you at university, you then graduated, you became a solicitor, you were able to really get there in that zone to pursue your passion of actually helping people who are the victims of injustice, people who can't necessarily afford or have the ability to gain access to legal aid and legal support. Tell us about that journey. Tell us about your first job after university. What was that like?
Well, I qualified finally as a solicitor in October 1985, and my first job as a legal aid solicitor was a job I took up when I moved to Birmingham. In actual fact, in 1986. And I moved to Birmingham to work in a law centre on the Alum Rock Road. Wow. In Saltley, in Birmingham. I don't know if some of your viewers might or might not know the area, but that's where I took up a post as a solicitor in a law centre on the Alum Rock Road. And basically the work that I was doing there was providing advice, assistance and legal representation to the local community there. I worked in the areas of immigration law, employment law and housing law. And I worked in the law centre for about 3 years. I then moved to just up the road, actually, still working on the Alum Rock Road, to a local legal aid law firm that had an office on the Alum Rock Road. And I moved up the road to there, spent another 7 years there. So I worked for 10 years on the Alum Rock Road, specialising in immigration law, employment law and housing law. But it was always housing law that was my main specialism. And that's the specialist area of law that I practiced in for the next 35 years. So I would represent people who are at risk of eviction from their homes, those living in poor housing conditions and the homeless. And I became a partner in that legal aid law firm, and I was a partner in that legal aid law firm for 22 years. Wow.
Now, Simon, going to the Alum Rock Road to Birmingham in 1985, I know, for example, my grandfather moved from Bradford to Birmingham back in 1982, and at that time, you had so many elders coming here who, for whom English wasn't their first language. A lot of struggles, a lot of difficulty. What did you see back then in terms of the life that people were living, their living standards, the housing, as well as the employment? What type of challenges were you helping them address back then?
Yeah, there were a lot of challenges that the local community faced there, both, as I say, particularly in terms of housing, in terms of employment rights, and in terms of their immigration rights as well. And it was something that I was immensely committed to. I was immensely dedicated to serving that local community there. I wanted to make sure that they had access to justice, and they had an opportunity to take advantage of what legal rights they had in those different circumstances. And yes, plainly, there was a significant amount of deprivation. There was a significant amount of poverty in that community. And of course, for those of you who will be familiar with that area, there were a lot of people there who had come to the UK, whose particularly the older members of the community, for whom for whom English was not a first language, of course. But obviously there was a second generation, their sons, daughters, who were growing up there as well, and it was a fantastic experience working within that community, because notwithstanding the deprivation and the poverty and the challenges that they had, there was a real sense of community and solidarity, and it was a community that made you feel very welcome working there, and I really enjoyed it immensely.
And you were there as a person able to support them and help them at a time when they wouldn't know how to navigate those services. And I hear stories even today of younger children having to go in and translate for mum and dad because obviously they couldn't speak English at the time. And also my grandfather would tell me that we had to go to various factories and places and explain to the factory owners what Eid was, because people didn't know what Eid was and what Ramadan was, and all of these things that are really common knowledge today weren't known back then, Simon.
Yeah, no, I mean that was very common. Yes, I mean clients would often turn up with young members of the family accompanying them in order to translate. That was very common, but it was really, there were so many cases that one dealt with on a day-to-day basis, a week-to-week basis, a month-to-month basis, a year-to-year basis, in which you had the opportunity to provide them with the with access to their legal rights in a way that they probably would not otherwise have had if the law centre wasn't there, if the legal aid law firm that I was working for on the Alam Rock Road there weren't there. You know, we were able to provide them with a really significant service around housing and employment and immigration and social security rights. And I do think that made a significant difference to so many of those people's lives, for sure.
You spent many decades of your life doing that, Simon, really impacting people's lives, becoming their advocate, becoming their voice when they really had no voice on those types of issues. Where did the political transition come from? Was it a feeling that law didn't quite go as far as you wanted to in terms of addressing injustice, inequality, unfairness that you were witnessing every day of your work?
I think I always realised that it was important that the two had to operate in tandem. I mean, plainly, you needed you needed action on a political front if you were going to effect change, and obviously you could do that on a professional level, practicing law in the way that I chose to do so. I mean, I guess I joined Labour students when I went to Sheffield University back in 1979. I joined the Labour Party for the first time back in 1983. So, I mean, that's what, 37, 38 years ago. So I was always aware of the importance of politics if you were going to be able to make change for the better in people's lives. So that was something I was always well aware of. I guess partly as a consequence of, although I was quite active politically, I guess in the 1980s, when I got married, when I had 3 young daughters, I was a partner in a law firm. I was working very long hours as a legal aid solicitor. Obviously, I didn't have quite the time available to pursue any alternative active politics. But I suppose I always felt that the work I was doing as a legal aid solicitor was a kind of reflection of my politics at the time.
And when did you get back involved politically then, in terms of your legal aid career? Obviously has got busier and busier over the years. The challenges have changed, the era has changed, but the demand was still there. When did you decide to give more time towards the political activism side of things?
Yeah, well, I guess around about 2012, I was no longer a partner in a legal aid law firm, and a few years later, my 3 daughters had all, I guess, grown up and had either left home or were off to university. So I suppose that gave me some space and time that I had not previously had. And I guess it was an opportunity to re-engage in politics in a way that I probably hadn't had the time available to do for many years prior to that. So I guess it would have been around about 2000. It was probably the general election of 2015. That's when I kind of started to re-engage and become politically more active within the Labour Party. But as I say, I'd been a member of the Labour Party since 1983, and so that was something it had always been my party, and so I guess it was about 2015 that I started to get back involved in kind of active party politics.
And we will speak about what happened then, how you came to become the West Midlands Police and Crime Commissioner. But we are coming up to a break. Remember to stay tuned, dear viewers, because the journey continues in terms of Simon Foster, his life, his career, and how his contribution to the legal profession, his contribution to the lives of so many vulnerable people in inner city Birmingham, in the centre of Alam Rock, no less, has really motivated and inspired him to do what he does today. And a really rich history there that so many of you watching now would have heard from your parents, your grandparents, around their journey and their life, and how they came to be here in this country, and how they were able to avail themselves of the opportunities that have ultimately made the likes of you and me able to enjoy the positions and lifestyles that we do today. If you've got a question for Simon, we'd love to hear from you. 01924 231 083 is a studio number. That's 01924 231 083. If you are on Twitter, you can get us on @BritishMuslimTV, and Facebook, it is British Muslim TV. We'd love to hear from you on Behind the Headlines this evening. We're coming up to a break. We're going to be back for the final segment. Would you believe it or not? Time flies when you're having fun. We'll be back right after this break. Stay tuned to British Muslim TV. Dear viewers, assalamu alaikum, and welcome back to the final part already of Behind the Headlines here on British Muslim TV. An absolute pleasure to have you with us on this cold but beautiful Friday evening. Alhamdulillah. We're in conversation today with the West Midlands Police and Crime Commissioner, Simon Foster. He is in charge of the second largest police force in the entire country, a legal aid solicitor of over 40 years, and someone who has always helped the poorest and most vulnerable in whatever job he's done. And we just left him in 2015 before the break, as he became more and more involved in the Labour Party, a party that he now represents in the office of Police and Crime Commissioner. Those few years, Simon, active in the Labour Party since 2015. Obviously, you've been a member for many, many decades before. What was it like? What inspired you to get more involved? You had more time, as you said. Many of your children had left home and you were able to do that. Were you still very much continuing with your legal work at the time?
Yeah, no, I mean, I was still working full-time as a legal aid solicitor during that period of time, working very hard, working on, housing rights, completely still dedicated to that. I mean, by the time I became more engaged in politics, as I say, politics had always been a passion for me. And, I'd always, as I say, from a very young age, always understood the importance of political action if you were going to effect change for the better for people. So that was something that I'd always had within me. And as I say, in many respects, I'd felt that my work was a kind of reflection of my political convictions over many, many years. But I guess, as I say, at that time, I had an opportunity to re-engage in a way that I perhaps hadn't had for many, many years.
Sure.
So, I became more involved in the Labour Party. For example, I was elected to the National Policy Forum in 2018. So, but I mean, at the stage that I stood, or at least I sought, I guess I commenced my journey to become the Police and Crime Commissioner. I'd never stood for any public office before in my life, so it was a very new experience in that sense. And of course, becoming the Labour candidate to begin with is quite a challenging process, as you will well be aware, particularly for a role like the West Midlands Police and Crime Commissioner. So there was a lengthy hard-fought campaign to become shortlisted in the first place, and then obviously to run an election campaign within the party in order to be selected on a one-member, one-vote basis to become the candidate in the first place. And I mean, that was probably a 7 or 8 month commitment. And once I got selected as the candidate in September 2019. I mean, by then, my legal career had started 42 years before. I'd practiced as a legal aid solicitor for 35 years. And I decided that if I was going to be serious about becoming elected as the West Midlands Police and Crime Commissioner, I needed to commit myself to this process 100%. So in October 2019, I took a sabbatical from work in order to be able to work on the campaign full time. Obviously, at the time, I thought that was going to be for about 8 months. But for all the reasons that we'll be familiar with, come May 2020, the election was, of course, postponed. And then I had a choice then, was I going to go back to work for a short period of time or just continue on the campaign? And I decided that on the principle that I'd started, I was going to finish. I remained working on the campaign full time thereafter, right up until May 2021.
And those principles, and I can very much vouch for them as well, Simon, because you're actually a very unique entity in terms of a politician. Simon is the type of person who would always go above and beyond for anyone. And I certainly recall, Simon, during your campaign, if you had a meeting booked with whoever, even if the Prime Minister called you in, or whoever it was that would call you in, even if the leader of your party would call you, Simon would never cancel on whoever he had engaged to see on that particular day. And that's quite a unique quality. But I guess, Simon, very much grounded in your life experience. You've never been fazed by grandeur. You've never been fazed by any of those opulence that the legal career could have opened up for you. You could have made far more money, for example, going into properties or going into another type of the legal profession. But that grounding, I suppose, in community has very much remained with you even now in the political office you hold. So take me to 2021, when the elections eventually took place. What was election night like for you? What was it like for you? Your predecessor was also a Labour Police and Crime Commissioner, and the predecessor before that was also a Labour Police and Crime Commissioner. Did you feel that you had it in the bag?
I think any politician who thinks they've got an election in the bag has probably made their last big mistake. I guess complacency is something that I guard against in all circumstances. I think you should never be complacent about those sorts of things, and you should certainly never ever take the electorate and the people for granted at all, under any circumstances. You have to be completely committed to the process, and you have to be completely committed to serving the interests of the people and communities who you're seeking to elect you to a post. And having been elected, having the honour and the privilege to be elected, I mean, I have to say that it was a kind of surreal experience in one sense, because of course at that stage, once election day comes along, there's nothing ultimately. I mean, no matter how hard you worked throughout the process, and I did work very hard, of course at that stage there's nothing you can do to control the outcome. People are going to vote how they're going to vote, and you know, that might be for you, it might be for somebody else, and all you can do is to await the outcome and the judgment of the electorate. And as I say, I was fortunate enough to, on that particular occasion, to be successful. And I guess my overwhelming sense, having been successful in that election, my overwhelming sense was that, and I know it may sound like a cliche, but it was the real sense of honour and privilege, and the level of trust and responsibility that had been invested in you as a consequence of people voting for you. And that is something that I take incredibly seriously. And I would say that since I've been elected, I feel that I've committed myself 100% to the role and the importance of representing people around the issues of crime and policing and criminal justice.
What's it been like for you, Simon? Clearly, all of your life championing the cause of tackling injustice. Now you're in such a senior office. It's been a very challenging time for policing around the world. We obviously saw the brutal murder of George Floyd in the United States, and a huge emphasis on the role of police there, and police reform required there. We've had issues of what's been categorized by some commentators as police brutality that's taken place in the past, unprecedented challenges. We've had the war on terror that's also been very controversial over the years, stop and search. So many issues that really are linked to policing. What's it been like for you going in there with your manifesto, with what you were elected to do, and now having to do the job, having to implement it with the finite resources you have?
I had some very clear ideas how I wanted to be as a police and crime commissioner in the event that I was fortunate enough to be elected. So I had a very clear programme around that. I was very clear that rebuilding community policing was a key core campaign pledge for me. Combating violence against women and girls and domestic abuse, preventing and tackling violence, and in particular knife crime. Understanding that as well as needing a robust criminal justice approach to these issues, you also need to have an approach that deals and focuses on prevention and early intervention and addressing the underlying cause of these issues, and also understanding that it doesn't matter how effective statutory bodies are, whether they're local authorities, whether they're health service or education, or the third sector, or our elected representatives, or indeed West Midlands Police. No matter how, doesn't matter how effective and efficient they are, without the buy-in and support of local communities, you are not going to succeed in addressing those big issues. So I really did understand the importance of community and making sure that that engaging with, listening to, and working with communities would be at the very forefront of my role as a police and crime commissioner. And that's why, you know, I said I wanted to be a people and communities police and crime commissioner, and that meant a police and crime commissioner that puts at the very forefront of the role engaging with, listening to, and working with communities.
Finally, Simon, for about 30 seconds, briefly, if you would, what advice would you give to people watching out there in terms of getting involved in politics, standing for public office, especially considering issues like Islamophobia, discrimination, hate crime that come to the forefront, and we've seen, sadly, even in the political spectrum? What would be your advice to them if they're looking to go forward?
I'd say have the courage of your convictions. Work hard, understand that you can make change for the better through politics. And if you have those convictions, then get involved, be active. You really can make a change for the better, and you really can change people's lives in a very material way, whether that's in relation to our health service, education, whether it's housing, whether it's social justice in so many other ways, whether it's their legal rights. And as far as the Police and Crime Commissioner is concerned, it's about making sure that they have access to services that will deal with crime, policing and criminal justice.
Thank you so much, Simon Foster. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the program. Thank you so much, dear viewers. We'll see you next week, inshallah. Until then, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.